A man who became at various points in his life the wealthiest private individual in the world, whose specific oil company investments in the Arabian Peninsula in the early 1950s generated returns that no conventional financial analysis of the available geological and political information at the time could have reliably predicted, who was so personally frugal that he installed a pay telephone in his English country house for guests to use rather than allowing them to make long-distance calls on his account, and who became one of the most studied figures in the history of American oil wealth for a specific quality of commercial judgment that he himself consistently described not as genius or analytical sophistication but as a specific combination of patience, willingness to accept risk that others found frightening, and an almost temperamental inability to panic during market downturns when every observable social signal was telling him that selling was the rational response. His name was Jean Paul Getty. Born in 1892 in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the son of George Franklin Getty, who had himself built a modest oil business in Oklahoma in the early years of the 20th century, he studied at Oxford in England before returning to work in his father's oil fields, where he made his first personal oil deal at 23 and his first $1 million by age 24, working within an industry whose specific economics he had studied from childhood at unusual depth. The specific investment decision that most clearly illustrates the quality of commercial judgment Getty possessed, and the specific temperamental characteristics that made that judgment genuinely unusual, was his pursuit of oil rights in the so-called neutral zone between Saudi Arabia and Kuwait beginning in the late 1940s. The neutral zone was a specific piece of desert territory whose oil potential had been evaluated and specifically rejected by virtually every major oil company that had looked at it, on the basis of geological surveys that were not encouraging and political circumstances that were genuinely complicated. Getty pursued the concession anyway, paying approximately $12.5 million for the rights in 1949, a sum that represented a very large portion of his then available capital and that most of his contemporaries at the time considered almost certainly a severe financial mistake. Morgan Housel has written that the specific investment decisions that produce the most dramatic long-term wealth outcomes are almost by definition the ones that look most frightening at the time they are made, because any investment that is obviously safe and obviously promising has already been priced to reflect its obvious characteristics, and therefore can only generate conventional returns. The specific investments that generate genuinely extraordinary returns are almost always ones that the relevant professional community has evaluated and specifically rejected, which means that making them requires a specific combination of independent analysis and temperamental willingness to be wrong in a very public and very expensive way. Getty's neutral zone decision had both of those characteristics in abundance. The oil discoveries in the neutral zone concession beginning in 1953 eventually proved to be among the most commercially significant in the history of Middle Eastern petroleum development. Getty's specific willingness to pay what seemed at the time like an excessive price for a concession that most professional analysts had dismissed as geologically unpromising, and to wait through multiple years of expensive exploration before the discoveries that validated that willingness were made, produced a return on his specific investment that most subsequent financial historians have described as one of the most dramatic single investment outcomes of the 20th century. Benjamin Graham's investment philosophy emphasized a specific and counterintuitive principle that he called the margin of safety, the idea that the specific investor most likely to achieve exceptional long-term returns is not the one who most accurately predicts the future performance of specific assets but the one who most consistently purchases assets at prices that provide a specific measurable buffer between the purchase price and a conservative estimate of the asset's intrinsic value, so that even significant errors in the analysis do not produce catastrophic losses. Getty's specific neutral zone decision cannot easily be described as a classic margin of safety investment in Graham's terms, since the geological case for oil discovery was genuinely uncertain. What it shared with the margin of safety philosophy was the specific temperamental characteristic of being willing to pay a price that reflected genuine uncertainty rather than optimistic projection, and of being psychologically prepared for the specific scenario in which the investment produced no return at all. Daniel Kahneman's research into how the specific emotional characteristics of individual investors shape their investment outcomes, particularly how tolerance for uncertainty and discomfort during periods of ambiguous or adverse developments determines whether an investor can hold a position long enough for its underlying thesis to be validated, applies directly to understanding what made Getty's specific approach to investment genuinely unusual. Most professional investors, operating with clients' capital and under the specific institutional pressure to demonstrate ongoing competent management through regular performance reporting, face structural incentives to exit positions that are not producing visible near-term returns, regardless of whether the underlying thesis for holding them remains intact. Getty, managing primarily his own capital, faced a significantly different set of structural incentives. He could hold the neutral zone concession through years of expensive and commercially unproductive exploration specifically because no external stakeholder was in a position to demand that he sell. Getty's specific personal frugality, which was extensive enough and well documented enough to have generated its own substantial mythology during his lifetime, was not, as some popular accounts have suggested, simply a personality quirk unrelated to his investment approach. It was a specific financial behavior pattern that preserved the specific personal capital flexibility that made his concentrated, patient, high-conviction investments possible. The pay telephone in his English country house, the careful expense management, the personal negotiation over transaction details that most people of his wealth level delegated entirely to subordinates, these were not the behaviors of a man who did not understand that he could afford to be more generous. They were the behaviors of a man who had specific, personal experience of how quickly large capital positions could be eroded by expenses that individually seemed trivial and collectively proved significant. Robert Kiyosaki's core lesson about the specific importance of understanding the difference between assets that produce ongoing returns and personal consumption that does not applies here in an almost extreme version. Getty's specific personal consumption was, throughout his long life, minimal relative to his actual wealth, not because he was incapable of spending more, but because his specific personal financial philosophy treated every dollar of unnecessary personal consumption as a dollar diverted from the productive asset deployment that was the actual source of his wealth. Here's an honest complication worth including. J. Paul Getty's specific personal behavior outside of his investment activities was, by all documented accounts, genuinely problematic in multiple dimensions. His relationships with his 5 wives and 5 sons were characterized, in the accounts of his children and multiple biographers, by a specific emotional detachment and financial control that produced severe long-term personal consequences for multiple members of his family. The most widely known episode, his specific initial response to the kidnapping of his grandson John Paul Getty III in 1973, when he reportedly declined to pay the ransom immediately on the ground that it would make his other grandchildren more attractive kidnapping targets, has been interpreted by different observers as cold calculation, as emotional detachment, or as both simultaneously. His extraordinary investment judgment and his extraordinary personal failures coexisted in the same person throughout his long life, and pretending that one can be fully understood without the other would be specifically incomplete. George S. Clason's advice about the patient, disciplined deployment of capital into specific productive assets, and about the specific importance of not panicking during adverse market conditions or allowing the opinions of the majority to substitute for one's own careful analysis, describes the specific behavioral foundation of Getty's investment success with considerable precision, even though Getty was operating in a specific industrial and geographic context that Clason's ancient Babylonian parables could not have directly anticipated. This isn't a simple story about investment genius, geological luck, or personal eccentricity. It's a story about a man who had developed, through decades of practical experience in the specific economics of oil exploration, a specific tolerance for the particular type of uncertainty that oil geology produces, the specific patience to hold a large, expensive, long-duration commitment through years of ambiguous results without the specific emotional or institutional pressure to abandon it before the thesis was resolved. So here's a question worth sitting with. In your own investment or professional life, have you ever held a specific long-duration commitment, to an investment, to a career direction, to a specific technical project, through a period of ambiguous or absent visible progress specifically because you believed the underlying thesis remained intact, rather than because the visible evidence was telling you to continue? Before you leave, I want to hear from you. Have you ever made a significant personal or financial decision that was publicly or socially considered obviously mistaken at the time you made it? And if it eventually produced the result you expected, did the people who had considered it mistaken update their assessment of the decision-making process, or only of the outcome? Read a few comments before you go. Some of the most honest reflections on this channel come from people who've thought carefully about the specific difference between evaluating a decision by its outcome versus evaluating it by the quality of the process that produced it. Next week, I'll pick one comment and send its author one of the books that inspired this channel. And if these stories help you think differently about money, you'll find a way to support future research in the description. Every contribution helps buy books, access research, and keep this content free for everyone. Remember this. J. Paul Getty did not become one of the wealthiest people in the world by making investment decisions that looked obviously correct at the time he made them. He made it by making specific decisions that looked obviously wrong to most of the professional analysts who evaluated the same information he was evaluating, and by having both the specific independent analysis and the specific personal temperament to hold those decisions through years of apparent validation of the majority view, until the minority view that he alone had maintained turned out to be specifically correct. A media executive who had spent 25 years building one of the most commercially successful television programs in American history, who at the peak of that program's run was reaching approximately 44 million viewers per week, who launched her own cable television network in January 2011 with enormous public anticipation and almost universal industry confidence that the launch would be commercially successful, spent the following 2 years watching that network lose money at a rate that multiple media industry analysts publicly described as a potential existential threat to the most recognizable personal brand in American media history. Her name was Oprah Winfrey. Born in 1954 in rural Mississippi in conditions of genuine material poverty, she has documented extensively in public accounts the specific severity of the early circumstances she experienced: poverty, abuse, adolescent pregnancy, before establishing herself in her early 20s as a television news anchor in Nashville and then Baltimore, and eventually as a local morning talk show host in Chicago in 1986, where The Oprah Winfrey Show debuted nationally and proceeded over the following 25 years to become both the longest-running daytime talk show in American television history and one of the most commercially lucrative television franchises ever built around a single personal brand. The specific business context of the Oprah Winfrey Network launch in 2011 matters for understanding what the network's early struggles actually represented. OWN was a joint venture between Winfrey's production company, Harpo Productions, and Discovery Communications, built on the specific premise that the personal brand equity Winfrey had accumulated over 25 years of The Oprah Winfrey Show could be translated into audience loyalty for a full cable network offering original programming across a broader range of formats and topics than a single daily talk show could contain. The concept was commercially plausible. Other talent-based media brands had successfully anchored cable networks, and the specific Discovery partnership provided OWN with distribution infrastructure and operational resources that Harpo alone could not have assembled. Morgan Housel has written that the specific challenge of translating personal brand equity built in one specific media context into commercial success in a structurally different media context is one of the most reliably difficult transitions in the entertainment and media industries, because the specific consumer relationship that generates personal brand equity in one context is built on a specific set of expectations, viewing habits, and emotional associations that do not automatically transfer to a different context, regardless of how strong the brand equity was in its original setting. The specific audience relationship Winfrey had built over 25 years of The Oprah Winfrey Show was built on a specific daily appointment viewing habit in a specific daytime programming context, and translating that relationship into discretionary cable viewing required rebuilding a different kind of audience behavior from a foundation that the existing brand equity could inspire but could not itself create. OWN's first 2 years were commercially difficult in ways that were publicly documented and publicly discussed with an unusual level of candor, partly because the network's difficulties were significant enough that Discovery's own financial results were materially affected by them. The network's ratings in its first year were substantially below what the joint venture's business plan had projected, advertising revenue lagged well below target, and multiple senior executives departed the network within its first 18 months. Winfrey herself gave a widely discussed interview in which she described the experience of watching OWN's struggle as among the most personally and professionally difficult of her life, a specific admission from a person with her public profile of public vulnerability that itself reflected an unusual personal transparency. Benjamin Graham's investment philosophy emphasized that the specific value of any media business derives ultimately from a specific audience relationship, and that building a new audience relationship, even for the most well-resourced and most credentialed of operators, requires a specific and often extended period of trial, adjustment, and learning that cannot be shortcut by brand equity, distribution advantages, or any other structural resource that the operator brings to the venture. The specific difficulty OWN experienced in its first 2 years was not primarily evidence that the venture's underlying premise was wrong. It was evidence that the specific kind of audience relationship a cable network requires was genuinely different from the specific kind of audience relationship that had made Winfrey's personal brand so valuable in its original context. Daniel Kahneman's research into how people respond to specific large, public, and highly visible failures, particularly when those failures involve a domain in which the individual has previously achieved exceptional success, is directly relevant to understanding both the specific public and institutional dynamics of OWN's early struggles and Winfrey's specific personal response to them. Kahneman's work suggests that the specific experience of failing publicly in a domain where public success has previously been achieved produces a specific kind of reputational and psychological pressure that most people find extremely difficult to manage without either retreating from the failed endeavor or publicly minimizing its significance. Winfrey's specific response, remaining publicly involved with OWN, personally hosting a new original series on the network, and publicly describing the experience of the network's difficulty with unusual candor rather than retreat, represented a specific kind of public accountability that the available alternatives did not. The specific turning point in OWN's commercial performance came in 2012 and 2013, driven primarily by the specific success of a programming partnership with Tyler Perry, whose original series for OWN generated ratings that were meaningfully higher than anything the network had previously aired, and whose specific audience, predominantly Black women, a demographic that OWN's original programming had not specifically or effectively targeted, provided the network with a specific audience foundation from which subsequent programming could be developed. The network's advertising revenue and subscriber fees improved significantly following the Tyler Perry programming success, and by 2014 OWN had reached a level of consistent commercial viability that its first 2 years had not suggested was achievable. Robert Kiyosaki's core lesson about the specific importance of identifying and building toward the specific audience or customer whose genuine needs your product or service actually meets, rather than the audience you might have preferred to reach on the basis of your existing brand associations, applies directly to OWN's specific programming evolution. The specific programming approach that eventually stabilized OWN's commercial performance was, in important respects, different from the programming approach the network had originally been conceived around. That specific adjustment, acknowledging that the audience actually finding value in OWN's content was somewhat different from the audience the network's original business plan had assumed, was the specific learning that 2 years of publicly difficult commercial performance had made possible. Here's an honest complication worth including. The specific narrative of OWN's turnaround has sometimes been presented as though Winfrey's personal resilience and the eventual successful programming adjustments were the primary drivers of the network's survival. The specific role of Discovery Communications, which continued to fund the network's operations through its loss-making early period, providing both the financial resources and the operational infrastructure that made the network's continued existence possible while it was finding its audience, deserves a specific acknowledgement that purely personal brand-focused accounts of the OWN story tend to understate. The resilience was real. The institutional support that made sustaining that resilience commercially viable was also real, and specifically essential. George S. Clason's advice about the specific importance of learning from specific failures, treating them as specific expensive but valuable lessons in what does not work rather than as conclusions about what is possible, applies here in a way that Winfrey's own public statements about the own experience have reflected directly. She has described the specific 2-year period of OWN's difficulties as one of the most instructive experiences of her career, specifically in terms of what it forced her to learn about the difference between personal brand equity and genuine audience relationship, a distinction that, once learned in the way she learned it, could not subsequently be unlearned. This isn't a simple story about a great personal brand automatically producing great commercial results, or about resilience and public accountability automatically producing commercial turnarounds. The specific success OWN eventually achieved was the product of a specific combination of continued institutional financial support, a specific programming breakthrough that reached an audience the network had not originally targeted, and a specific set of operational adjustments informed by 2 years of expensive commercial experience. The personal resilience and public accountability were necessary but not sufficient conditions for the outcome that followed. So here's a question worth sitting with. In your own career or business, have you ever discovered that the specific audience or customer whose needs your product or service genuinely meets was meaningfully different from the audience you originally designed it for? And if so, how long did it take you to recognize that difference, and how difficult was it to make the specific adjustment the recognition required? Before you leave, I want to hear from you. Have you ever watched someone with genuinely exceptional credentials and genuinely strong personal brand equity fail publicly in a new context? And did that failure change your assessment of the specific limits of brand equity as a commercial asset? Read a few comments before you go. Some of the most practically grounded insights on this channel come from people who've thought carefully about exactly where the limits of personal brand equity actually lie. Next week, I'll pick one comment and send its author one of the books that inspired this channel. And if these stories help you think differently about money, you'll find a way to support future research in the description. Every contribution helps buy books, access research, and keep this content free for everyone. Remember this. Oprah Winfrey did not rescue OWN from 2 years of public commercial difficulty by doubling down on the programming approach that had made the Oprah Winfrey Show the most successful daytime talk show in American television history. She rescued it by publicly acknowledging that a different approach was needed, by remaining personally committed to the venture through a period when retreat would have been the path of least reputational resistance, and by being willing to find, through expensive experience, the specific audience whose genuine needs OWN's programming actually met. A man who held more than 1,000 patents, who invented or significantly refined the phonograph, the practical incandescent light bulb, the motion picture camera, and dozens of other technologies that shaped the 20th century, who was so commercially effective at combining technical invention with industrial manufacturing and distribution that he built the world's first industrial research laboratory specifically to produce commercially usable inventions on something approaching a scheduled basis, lost control of the electrical power company he founded, the company that eventually became General Electric, specifically because his specific and deeply personal commitment to direct current electrical distribution made him unable to accept, and eventually unable to compete against, the specific technical case for alternating current that his own employee Nikola Tesla and his commercial rival George Westinghouse were simultaneously making. His name was Thomas Alva Edison. Born in 1847 in Milan, Ohio, as the last of 7 children, he demonstrated from early childhood a specific combination of intense curiosity, practical mechanical aptitude, and an unusual ability to focus on specific technical problems for extended periods, qualities that his formal schooling apparently found more disruptive than promising, since he was withdrawn from school after only a few months and educated primarily by his mother at home. He became a telegraph operator in his teenage years, a job that gave him both a technical understanding of electrical systems and a specific entrepreneurial instinct for identifying commercial opportunities in the industries those systems served. By his early 30s, Edison had established himself, through a specific series of inventions and commercially successful technology commercializations, as the most famous inventor in the United States and arguably in the world. His specific approach to invention, which he institutionalized at his Menlo Park laboratory beginning in 1876 in a form that had no significant precedent in the history of industrial technology, was not the romantic image of the solitary genius struck by sudden inspiration. It was a specific, organized, well-funded, team-based process of systematic experimentation directed specifically at technical problems that Edison had independently concluded had commercially valuable solutions available if sufficient resources were applied to finding them. The specific genius was partly technical and partly organizational. Edison's ability to select the right technical problems, assemble the right teams, and sustain the right level of experimental effort until specific working solutions were found. Morgan Housel has written that one of the most instructive and most overlooked patterns in the history of technological innovation is that the specific people who create genuinely transformative technologies are often not the same people who best navigate the transition from technical invention to commercial dominance, and that the specific personal characteristics most valuable for making the initial technical breakthrough are sometimes the same characteristics that make adapting to subsequent technical competition specifically difficult. Edison's specific situation in the late 1880s and early 1890s illustrates this pattern with a clarity that is, in retrospect, almost painful. The War of Currents, the specific commercial and technical conflict between Edison's direct current electrical distribution system and the alternating current system championed by Westinghouse and technically developed in significant part by the specific Tesla who had briefly worked in Edison's own laboratories, was not primarily a technical dispute about which system was technically superior. By the late 1880s, the technical case for alternating current was sufficiently well established that most electrical engineers who examined the question without a prior commercial commitment to either system found it fairly compelling. The specific dispute was a commercial and reputational one. Edison had invested enormously in direct current infrastructure, had publicly staked his reputation on the superiority of direct current, and had built the early commercial electrical distribution system in the United States around the specific direct current architecture that his specific technical approach had produced. Benjamin Graham's investment philosophy included a specific warning about the particular danger of what might be called committed capital, capital already invested in a specific approach or infrastructure whose competitive value has been challenged by a technically superior alternative. The specific economic logic of sunk cost, which tells a rational economic actor that capital already spent is irrelevant to decisions about future allocation, is systematically overridden in actual human decision-making by the specific psychological attachment to the committed capital and to the specific approach it represents. Edison's specific response to the technical and commercial challenge of alternating current was not primarily a technical or financial analysis of the relative merits of the two systems. It was a specifically motivated defense of the system he had built and in which he had invested both capital and personal reputation. Daniel Kahneman's research into confirmation bias, the specific human tendency to seek, interpret, and remember information in ways that confirm existing beliefs and commitments rather than challenging them, applies with direct and documented relevance to Edison's specific handling of the alternating current challenge. Edison commissioned and publicized specific technical demonstrations designed to show the dangers of alternating current, including the use of alternating current for the first electric chair execution in 1890, in an explicit attempt to associate the technology with lethality in the public mind. These specific demonstration choices were not primarily the product of a dispassionate technical assessment of relative safety. They were the product of a specific motivated reasoning process in which the conclusion, that direct current was superior, was fixed, and the evidence was selected to support it. Edison's direct current infrastructure required generating stations roughly every mile to maintain adequate transmission voltage, which made it economically impractical for rural electrification and for many industrial applications that required power transmission over longer distances. Alternating current, which could be transmitted at high voltage over long distances and stepped down for local distribution through transformers, was technically far more suitable for a national electrical grid of the scale and geographic extent that the United States required. The specific commercial implications of this technical difference were not subtle or ambiguous by the early 1890s. Robert Kiyosaki's core lesson about understanding exactly where genuine, long-term, durable commercial value actually lies, as opposed to where it appears to lie based on current sunk investment and current market position, applies directly to the specific situation Edison faced. The genuine long-term commercial value in the electrical distribution industry lay in the infrastructure that would most effectively serve a national grid at industrial scale. That infrastructure was alternating current. Edison's direct current infrastructure, however technically sophisticated and commercially valuable at the specific scale it had been built, could not economically serve the larger national opportunity that alternating current specifically could. Recognizing that distinction, at the moment when it required abandoning or fundamentally restructuring the specific investment that represented the majority of Edison's commercial legacy in electrical distribution, was the specific adaptive challenge that Edison did not successfully make. Here's an honest complication worth including. The specific historical account of the War of Current sometimes emphasizes Edison's specific failures of judgment in ways that understate the genuine technical uncertainty that characterized the early period of the dispute. In the late 1880s, before the Westinghouse Company had fully demonstrated the safety and commercial viability of alternating current at industrial scale, the specific safety concerns Edison raised about high-voltage alternating current transmission were not entirely without technical foundation. The question was not whether alternating current was genuinely more dangerous at high transmission voltages, it was. The question was whether those specific dangers could be adequately managed through engineering and safety protocol development, and whether the specific economic advantages of alternating current over long-distance transmission were large enough to justify the specific development investment required to manage those dangers safely at commercial scale. George S. Clason's advice about the specific importance of continuously updating your assessment of where productive opportunity actually lies, rather than protecting past commitments that no longer represent the most productive deployment of available resources, applies here with a specific force that Edison's own example illustrates by its specific costs. Edison lost control of the company that became General Electric not because his early direct current infrastructure was without value but because his specific personal commitment to it prevented the company from making the technical transition that would have allowed it to remain competitive in the specific electrical distribution market it was trying to serve. This isn't a simple story about a brilliant inventor being wrong about one specific technical question. Edison's overall career record of technical achievement and commercial success was genuinely extraordinary. What the specific War of Currents episode illustrates is a structural challenge that is distinct from technical genius and distinct from commercial acumen, the specific ability to recognize when a prior commitment, however genuinely valuable and however personally significant, has been superseded by a technically and commercially superior alternative, and to make the specific difficult transition that recognition requires. So here's a question worth sitting with. In your own professional or financial life, is there a specific prior commitment, an investment, a skill set, a technology, a business approach, that you have continued to defend and invest in specifically because of the prior investment it represents, even as some part of your assessment of the relevant evidence has suggested that a different approach might be more productive? Before you leave, I want to hear from you. Have you ever watched a highly capable person or organization defend a prior commitment specifically past the point where the defense was commercially rational, and did you recognize clearly at the time what was happening, or did the recognition only come in retrospect? Read a few comments before you go. Some of the most practically useful insights on this channel come from people who've answered that question honestly from their own professional experience. Next week, I'll pick one comment and send its author one of the books that inspired this channel. And if these stories help you think differently about money, you'll find a way to support future research in the description. Every contribution helps buy books, access research, and keep this content free for everyone. Remember this. Thomas Edison did not lose control of the electrical company he founded because he was less inventive than his competitors, less commercially skilled than his rivals, or less aware of the specific technical developments that were challenging his specific infrastructure investment. He lost it because the specific personal and financial commitment he had already made to one specific technical approach was large enough, and personally significant enough, that recognizing its supersession required a kind of adaptive judgment that the specific depth of the prior commitment had made genuinely and specifically difficult to exercise.